Listen to the prevailing wisdom in our universities today, and you'll hear a curious thing: history happens to people, not because of them. Great impersonal forces, economic systems, social structures, technological inevitabilities, these are what truly shape human destiny, we're told. Individual character. A quaint Victorian notion. Personal responsibility. An outdated concept from a less enlightened age. Napoleon was merely capitalism on horseback. Churchill was just the inevitable product of imperial circumstances. Lincoln. A puppet of industrial forces beyond his control. What utter nonsense. In 4 decades of studying the human story, I've learned one inescapable truth: character is destiny, not just for individuals but for entire civilizations. The progressive historians who dominate our academies have it precisely backwards. They've reduced the magnificent drama of human history to a series of impersonal equations, draining it of moral meaning and human agency. They've turned the greatest figures in history into cardboard cutouts, helpless victims of their times rather than the extraordinary individuals who bent those times to their will. Today, I want to demolish this fashionable determinism once and for all. We'll examine how real history works, how singular individuals with exceptional character repeatedly shattered the supposedly iron laws of historical inevitability. Because understanding this isn't merely an academic exercise. In our own age of apparent decline, we desperately need to recover the truth that character still matters, that individuals can still change the world, that we are not prisoners of vast impersonal forces but masters of our own destiny. Chapter 1: The Fatal Flaw of Modern Historical Thinking. The rot began, as so many intellectual corruptions do, with the best of intentions. In the 19th century, historians quite rightly sought to make their discipline more scientific, more rigorous. They wanted to move beyond the old-fashioned chronicle of kings and battles towards something more comprehensive. This impulse was admirable. The problem arose when they began treating human beings as if they were molecules in a chemistry experiment. Marx was the great culprit here, though hardly the only one. His materialist conception of history reduced human motivation to economic interest and portrayed individuals as mere expressions of class consciousness. According to this view, it mattered little whether the Russian Revolution was led by Lenin or someone else. The economic contradictions of capitalism made revolution inevitable. The specific character, intelligence, and ruthless will of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov were irrelevant details in the grand march of historical necessity. This thinking infected even non-Marxist historians. The French Annals School, for all its valuable insights into social and economic patterns, systematically downplayed the role of individual agency. Fernand Braudel could write magnificent histories of the Mediterranean world that somehow made the extraordinary personalities of that region seem like footnotes to grain prices and trade routes. The new social history of the 1960s and 70s promised to recover the experiences of ordinary people, but ended up treating all human beings, great and small, as passive victims of historical forces. What these approaches fundamentally misunderstand is the nature of historical causation. Yes, broad social and economic trends create the conditions within which individuals operate. But at crucial moments, everything depends on who steps forward to meet the challenge. The same economic crisis that produced Hitler in Germany and Roosevelt in America demonstrates perfectly how much depends on character rather than circumstances. Consider the American Revolution. Progressive historians love to explain it through economic grievances and class tensions. Yet thousands of colonists faced identical economic pressures, and most remained loyal to the crown. What made the difference? The character of men like Washington, Jefferson, and Adams, their willingness to risk everything for principles that couldn't be reduced to material interest. Washington's decision to surrender power after victory was utterly unprecedented in human history. No economic theory predicted it, no social force required it. It sprang from his extraordinary character, shaped by a lifetime of moral formation. This matters enormously because how we understand the past shapes how we approach the present. If history is merely the product of impersonal forces, then individual responsibility becomes meaningless. We become passive observers of our own lives, waiting for the right social conditions to create the changes we desire. But if character matters, if extraordinary individuals can still change the world through moral courage and determined action, then we bear the awesome responsibility of becoming the kind of people our times demand. Chapter 2: When Great Men Shattered Historical Laws. Let me show you how individual character repeatedly demolished what historians later called inevitable. Take Napoleon Bonaparte, please. Take him before he destroys Europe. According to determinist thinking, his rise was simply capitalism's need for a strong man to consolidate bourgeois revolution. Yet this ignores everything that actually happened. France had hundreds of talented generals. The Directory had numerous ambitious politicians. What made Napoleon different wasn't his class position or economic function, but his extraordinary combination of military genius, political cunning, and sheer force of personality. Watch him at the Battle of Austerlitz. No economic theory explains his brilliant tactical innovation or his ability to inspire exhausted soldiers to superhuman efforts. His victory wasn't predetermined by material conditions, it resulted from months of careful planning, perfect timing, and the kind of intuitive battlefield genius that can't be reduced to social forces. One different decision, one moment of hesitation, and European history changes completely. But Napoleon's character contained fatal flaws that ultimately destroyed him. His megalomaniacal pride led him to invade Russia against all military wisdom. His inability to accept limitations drove him to fight one coalition too many. These weren't inevitable results of historical forces, they were the logical consequences of specific character defects in a particular individual who happened to wield enormous power. Consider Winston Churchill in 1940, surely the most dramatic example of character triumphing over circumstances in modern history. By every rational calculation, Britain should have sought peace with Hitler. The military situation was hopeless. The Dominions were reluctant partners. America remained neutral. Any reasonable analysis of objective conditions suggested accommodation with Nazi Germany. Yet Churchill's extraordinary character, his romantic attachment to British greatness, his instinctive understanding of evil, his magnificent rhetoric that could transform military disaster into spiritual victory, kept Britain fighting at the precise moment when surrender seemed sensible. His speeches didn't merely reflect public opinion, they created it. His refusal to consider defeat wasn't based on cool analysis of material factors, it sprang from deep moral convictions about civilization and barbarism that he'd carried since youth. The progressive historians hate acknowledging this because it makes their theories look foolish. They prefer to emphasize underlying social currents and inevitable American involvement and Hitler's strategic errors. But none of these factors would have mattered if Britain had fallen in 1940. Churchill's character was the hinge on which world history turned. Lincoln provides another devastating example. The United States faced identical constitutional crises repeatedly before 1860, over nullification, over slavery expansion, over sectional tensions. Yet only Lincoln possessed the unique combination of moral clarity and political genius necessary to preserve the Union. Douglas or Bell or any of the other available politicians would have either provoked immediate war through clumsy handling or allowed peaceful dissolution through excessive compromise. Lincoln's character, forged through years of moral reflection on slavery's evil and constitutional study of Union's value, provided the precise qualities the moment required. His ability to combine flexibility on tactics with firmness on principles, his genius for finding the exact words to explain complex moral positions, his willingness to bear enormous personal burdens for the sake of future generations, these weren't inevitable products of historical forces. They were the magnificent flowering of a specific individual's character, cultivated through decades of preparation for a moment he couldn't have anticipated. Chapter 3: Faith as the Foundation of Moral Character. Here we arrive at the heart of the matter, though it's precisely what modern historians most desperately want to avoid. The great figures who actually changed history weren't motivated primarily by material interests or social forces, but by transcendent moral convictions rooted in religious faith. This is the inconvenient truth that makes progressive historians so uncomfortable they'll twist themselves into intellectual pretzels to avoid acknowledging it. Take Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, an achievement that should have been impossible according to materialist theories. Here was a practice that generated enormous profits for powerful interests, was deeply embedded in economic structures, and was defended by respectable intellectuals with elaborate racial theories. Every objective factor favored slavery's continuation. Yet a small group of Christian activists, motivated by religious conviction that slavery was sinful, gradually transformed public opinion and achieved abolition. Wilberforce's character was shaped fundamentally by his evangelical conversion experience. His tireless campaigns, his ability to maintain hope through decades of defeat, his sophisticated understanding of how to change hearts and minds, all flowed from his belief that he was serving God's purposes in history. No amount of economic analysis explains his extraordinary persistence in what seemed a hopeless cause. The same pattern appears throughout Western history. The great reformers, the builders of institutions, the creators of art and literature that still moves us, they were motivated by what they saw as divine callings rather than material ambitions. Medieval cathedral builders worked for generations on projects they knew they'd never see completed, sustained by faith that they were participating in something eternal. Renaissance artists transformed European culture because they believed beauty reflected divine truth. The founders of universities, hospitals, and charitable institutions were responding to Christian obligations to love their neighbors. Consider how Christian character shaped American founding principles. The constitutional framework that progressives now take for granted, limited government, individual rights, separation of powers, didn't emerge from economic interests but from Protestant theological insights about human nature and divine authority. Madison's genius lay in translating theological understanding of sin into practical political arrangements. Jefferson's magnificent declaration that all men are created equal was a theological claim about human dignity that contradicted every materialist theory about natural hierarchy. Modern historians desperately want to secularize these achievements, to pretend they resulted from Enlightenment rationalism rather than Christian faith. But the evidence is overwhelming that even supposedly secular Enlightenment thinkers were working within fundamentally Christian assumptions about human dignity, moral obligation, and historical purpose. When they abandoned those assumptions, as in revolutionary France, the results were catastrophic. This matters enormously for understanding our current cultural crisis. The character-forming institutions that produced previous generations of extraordinary leaders were fundamentally religious in nature. Family worship, rigorous moral education, personal accountability to divine authority, these weren't quaint cultural ornaments but the actual foundations of character development. As we've systematically secularized our culture, we've undermined the sources of the very character traits we still expect to see in our leaders. We want integrity without absolute moral standards, courage without transcendent purposes, wisdom without humility before eternal truths. It's like expecting a magnificent cathedral while demolishing its foundations. The great individuals who changed history understood that character formation requires submission to authority greater than personal preference or social convention. They cultivated virtue not because it was personally beneficial but because it was objectively required by moral reality. This is why secularized leadership development programs produce clever managers but rarely generate the kind of transformative figures our ancestors took for granted. Chapter 4: The Intellectual's Betrayal of Character. Now we encounter one of history's most persistent and destructive patterns, the tendency of intellectuals to construct elaborate theories that justify abandoning the very moral standards that make civilization possible. This isn't accidental or coincidental. It reveals something profound about the relationship between abstract thinking and practical virtue that every age must understand if it hopes to avoid catastrophic errors. Consider the parade of brilliant intellectuals who enthusiastically supported totalitarian movements in the 20th century. Shaw and Wells praising Soviet efficiency. Sartre defending Stalinist purges. Heidegger joining the Nazi Party. These weren't ignorant peasants swept up by propaganda, they were among the most sophisticated thinkers of their generation. Yet their intellectual sophistication became a tool for rationalizing moral blindness. The pattern is always the same. First, the intellectual constructs a theory that makes traditional moral judgments appear naive or outdated. Class struggle makes individual virtue irrelevant. Historical necessity justifies present cruelty. Scientific progress requires abandoning superstitious moral constraints. The theory becomes a kind of intellectual narcotic that numbs moral sensibility while providing the intoxicating sense of superior understanding. Rousseau pioneered this destructive approach. Despite living a life of spectacular moral failure, abandoning his children, betraying his friends, wallowing in paranoid self-pity, he constructed elaborate theories about natural goodness and social corruption that made his personal failings seem like noble responses to civilizational decay. His intellectual disciples inherited both his theoretical framework and his talent for moral self-justification. Marx perfected the technique. His personal life was a disaster of financial irresponsibility, family neglect, and bitter feuds with former allies. Yet he created a theoretical system that transformed these character defects into virtues. Personal morality became bourgeois prejudice. Individual responsibility was false consciousness. The suffering he caused his family was justified by his service to historical necessity. What's particularly insidious about this intellectual betrayal is how it corrupts the very activity of thinking itself. Instead of using reason to understand moral reality, intellectuals begin using reason to escape moral reality. They become increasingly clever at constructing arguments that justify whatever they want to do while maintaining their sense of intellectual superiority over those simple souls who still believe in old-fashioned virtue. This corruption spreads because intellectual prestige gives these theories social influence far beyond their actual worth. University students absorb sophisticated-sounding arguments that make moral standards appear arbitrary or oppressive. Cultural leaders adopt theoretical frameworks that excuse their own behavioral failures. Eventually, entire societies begin to embrace ideas that their grandparents would have recognized immediately as elaborate justifications for vice. The tragedy is that many of these intellectuals possess genuine talents that could have been used for constructive purposes. Shaw was a brilliant dramatist when he focused on human character rather than political theory. Heidegger made genuine contributions to philosophy when he wasn't rationalizing Nazi ideology. Sartre could write movingly about human experience when he abandoned his absurd political theories. But intellectual talent without moral character becomes a destructive force rather than a constructive one. The more sophisticated the intellect, the more elaborate the rationalization, the more devastating the eventual consequences. This is why previous generations wisely insisted that education must form character before developing cleverness, that moral training must precede intellectual sophistication. Our current educational system has reversed this priority. We produce technically skilled graduates who can construct brilliant arguments for virtually any position but lack the moral foundations necessary to distinguish between truth and cleverness, between wisdom and sophistication, between genuine insight and self-serving rationalization. This intellectual corruption has profound political consequences. When society's most educated and influential members abandon traditional moral standards, they undermine the character-forming institutions that produce responsible citizens. They create a culture where success is measured by cleverness rather than virtue, where theory matters more than practice, where being interesting becomes more important than being good. Chapter 5: Historical Patterns that Reveal Character Supremacy. If we step back and examine history with genuine objectivity, something progressive historians claim to do but rarely achieve, certain patterns emerge so consistently that only ideological blindness can ignore them. These patterns demolish the materialist interpretation of history and reveal character as the decisive factor in human affairs. First, consider how consistently similar economic and social conditions produce completely different outcomes depending on the character of available leadership. The Great Depression struck every Western nation with comparable severity, yet produced dramatically different political responses. Germany turned to Hitler, America chose Roosevelt, Britain maintained democratic institutions under MacDonald and Baldwin. The economic pressures were essentially identical. The critical variable was national character shaped by different cultural traditions and expressed through different individual leaders. Or examine how identical technological capabilities led to vastly different historical developments. Both Athens and Sparta possessed similar military technologies, yet one created the foundation of Western philosophy and art while the other remained a militaristic dead end. Both had access to the same geographic advantages and faced similar external pressures. The difference lay in their contrasting approaches to character formation, Athens encouraging individual excellence within civic responsibility, Sparta subordinating individual development to state control. This pattern repeats endlessly throughout history. Medieval Europe and the Islamic world shared similar technological capabilities, faced comparable economic challenges, and possessed equivalent intellectual resources. Yet one developed the institutional foundations of individual liberty while the other stagnated in despotism. The critical difference wasn't material but moral, the Christian emphasis on individual dignity versus the Islamic acceptance of arbitrary authority. Second, notice how consistently great historical achievements require individuals willing to sacrifice material advantage for moral principle. Every genuine advance in human liberty, every significant cultural achievement, every institutional innovation that enhanced human dignity, these resulted from people choosing character over comfort, principle over profit, long-term virtue over short-term advantage. The American Revolution succeeded because enough colonists were willing to risk our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor for abstract principles about human dignity that offered no material benefits. The abolition of slavery required decades of costly activism by people who gained nothing personally from ending an institution that didn't affect them directly. The development of constitutional government demanded leaders willing to limit their own power for the sake of future generations. Progressive historians find these examples intensely embarrassing because they can't be explained through materialist analysis. People acting against their immediate economic interests for the sake of moral principles. It shouldn't happen in a world governed by class struggle and historical necessity. Yet it happens repeatedly, and it's precisely what makes genuine historical progress possible. Third, observe how moral decline consistently precedes political and cultural collapse, regardless of material prosperity. Rome didn't fall because of economic crisis or military weakness, it fell because Roman character deteriorated. The wealthy classes abandoned civic responsibility for private pleasure. The political class chose personal advancement over public service. The cultural elite embraced sophistication over virtue. Gibbon understood this perfectly. Despite all his Enlightenment prejudices against Christianity, he couldn't ignore the evidence that Roman decline coincided with moral decay rather than material deprivation. The empire remained wealthy and technologically sophisticated even as it lost the character traits that had made it great. We're witnessing the same pattern in our own time. America possesses unprecedented material prosperity, technological capability, and military power. Yet our institutions are failing because we've systematically undermined the character-forming processes that previous generations took for granted. We've replaced moral education with value neutrality, character formation with self-esteem building, personal responsibility with victimhood consciousness. The result is a generation of leaders, in politics, business, education, and culture, who possess technical skills but lack the moral foundations necessary for genuine leadership. They can manage complex systems but can't inspire trust. They can manipulate public opinion but can't provide authentic moral guidance. They can achieve short-term success but can't build institutions that endure. Understanding these patterns isn't merely an intellectual exercise. It's an urgent practical necessity for anyone who wants to contribute to cultural renewal rather than cultural decay. Chapter 6: Providence and Pattern in Human Affairs. Here we approach the deepest level of historical understanding, the dimension that materialist historians cannot even acknowledge without destroying their entire theoretical framework. Yet it's precisely this dimension that explains why character matters so much in human affairs and why certain individuals appear at exactly the moments when their particular qualities are most needed. I'm speaking of what previous generations called providence, the sense that human history, for all its apparent chaos and randomness, reveals patterns of meaning that transcend individual planning or social forces. This isn't about crude determinism or fatalistic acceptance of whatever happens. Rather, it's about recognizing that extraordinary individuals often possess qualities that seem almost perfectly suited to their historical moments, in ways that purely naturalistic explanations cannot adequately explain. Consider the timing of Lincoln's emergence. For decades, America wrestled with slavery's moral contradictions while lacking leaders capable of addressing them effectively. Then, precisely when the crisis reached its breaking point, appeared a man whose character combined the exact qualities the moment required: deep moral conviction about slavery's evil, sophisticated understanding of constitutional principles, exceptional political skill, and remarkable ability to communicate complex ideas in language that ordinary citizens could understand. The progressive historians want to treat this as historical accident, but the pattern appears too frequently to dismiss as mere coincidence. Churchill provides an even more striking example. Throughout the 1930s, he seemed like an anachronistic figure, a romantic imperialist out of step with modern democratic sensibilities. His warnings about Nazi Germany were dismissed by more sophisticated political minds who understood the economic and social forces that made war seem irrational. Yet when Britain faced its supreme test, Churchill's supposedly outdated qualities, his instinctive grasp of evil, his romantic attachment to national greatness, his ability to inspire through magnificent rhetoric, proved to be exactly what the moment demanded. This pattern extends beyond individual leaders to entire movements and cultural developments. The Protestant Reformation emerged precisely when medieval institutions had become corrupt enough to require transformation but before secular alternatives had developed. The American founding occurred at the unique historical moment when classical political wisdom, Christian moral insights, and Enlightenment institutional innovations could be synthesized into something genuinely new. The abolition movement gained momentum just as economic and technological changes made alternative labor systems practical. Progressive historians hate acknowledging these patterns because they suggest that human history has meaning beyond material causation, that individual character development serves purposes larger than personal advantage, that moral choices have consequences extending far beyond their immediate effects. They prefer to treat history as a series of accidents shaped by impersonal forces rather than as a moral drama in which character choices determine civilizational outcomes. But refusing to acknowledge these patterns doesn't make them disappear. It simply blinds us to dimensions of historical experience that previous generations understood intuitively. When we reduce history to material forces and social structures, we lose the ability to recognize how individual character formation serves transcendent purposes, How moral choices create the conditions for future possibilities. How present struggles participate in patterns of meaning that extend across generations. This has profound implications for how we understand our own historical moment. If history is merely the product of impersonal forces, then our individual choices matter very little, and we should focus primarily on changing social structures rather than developing personal character. But if providence works through character formation, if extraordinary individuals emerge when their qualities are most needed, if moral choices create possibilities that extend far beyond their immediate effects, then character development becomes our most important responsibility. We live in an age that desperately needs leaders with the character traits our ancestors took for granted: moral courage that doesn't require popular approval, intellectual honesty that acknowledges inconvenient truths, personal integrity that can't be purchased or intimidated, spiritual depth that provides perspective beyond material concerns. Such leaders don't emerge accidentally from favorable social conditions. They result from intentional character formation guided by transcendent moral standards. The question facing our generation is whether we'll recover the wisdom that character formation serves purposes larger than personal success, whether we'll embrace the responsibility of becoming the kind of people our times require, whether we'll recognize that providence works through those willing to subordinate personal advantage to moral obligation. Chapter 7: Reclaiming Character in an Age of Decline. So here we stand, at a crucial moment in our own national story, surrounded by the debris of failed progressive theories, yet somehow surprised that treating people like objects has produced a civilization filled with broken souls. The time has come to recover the wisdom our ancestors knew instinctively: that character matters more than cleverness, that virtue produces better outcomes than sophistication, that societies rise or fall based on the moral quality of their people rather than the efficiency of their systems. The evidence surrounds us on every side. We've spent 60 years implementing progressive theories about education, family structure, criminal justice, and cultural values. We've replaced character formation with self-esteem building, moral education with value neutrality, personal responsibility with therapeutic excuses. We've constructed elaborate social programs designed to address problems through institutional mechanisms rather than character development. The results speak for themselves. Our schools produce graduates who can manipulate complex technologies but can't distinguish between truth and opinion, between wisdom and cleverness, between genuine achievement and participation trophy mediocrity. Our families fragment because we've forgotten that marriages require the character traits of loyalty, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice rather than merely emotional satisfaction. Our politics descend into tribalistic warfare because we've lost the civic virtues that make democratic deliberation possible. Yet the progressive response to these failures is always the same: more programs, more funding, more sophisticated theories, more expert management. Never do they consider that the problem might lie in their fundamental assumptions about human nature and social causation. Never do they acknowledge that their decades of attacking traditional character-forming institutions might have contributed to the very problems they claim to want to solve. But consider the alternative approach that actually works. Look at any organization, institution, or community that still maintains high standards of performance and human flourishing. You'll find they've preserved traditional approaches to character formation even when surrounded by progressive decay. Military units that emphasize honor, duty, and personal responsibility produce effective soldiers and decent human beings. Religious communities that maintain moral standards and mutual accountability create environments where families thrive and individuals flourish. Educational institutions that prioritize character development alongside intellectual training graduate students prepared for genuine leadership rather than mere careerism. The path forward requires recovering these time-tested approaches to character formation while adapting them to contemporary circumstances. This means rebuilding institutions that take moral education seriously, families that teach virtue through example and expectation, schools that form character alongside transmitting knowledge, religious communities that provide moral guidance rather than therapeutic entertainment, civic organizations that cultivate public spirit rather than private advantage. Most importantly, it requires individuals willing to embrace the demanding work of character development in their own lives. You cannot give what you do not possess. You cannot lead others to virtue while remaining comfortable with your own vices. You cannot inspire others to moral courage while choosing personal safety. You cannot build institutions of integrity while accepting corruption in your own behavior. This is where the progressive historian's greatest error becomes most obvious. They treat character as an outdated concept because they refuse to acknowledge the moral demands it places on their own lives. It's much easier to blame social forces for human failures than to accept personal responsibility for moral choices. It's more comfortable to construct theories that excuse vice than to undertake the difficult work of virtue cultivation. But character formation isn't optional for those who want to contribute to cultural renewal rather than cultural decay. It requires the same kind of intentional effort, sustained commitment, and willingness to sacrifice immediate pleasure for long-term good that has always distinguished those who change history from those who merely complain about it. The encouraging news is that character still works. When individuals develop the classical virtues, courage, justice, temperance, prudence, when they cultivate the Christian graces, faith, hope, love, when they embrace the civic responsibilities of free citizens, they become forces for positive change regardless of their circumstances. They create families that flourish, institutions that endure, communities that attract others seeking genuine human flourishing. Most importantly, they become the kind of people who can recognize and respond to Providence's calling in their own historical moment, who can serve purposes larger than personal advantage, who can participate in the great work of transmitting civilization's best achievements to future generations. Conclusion. The great lie of our time is that individuals don't matter, that character is irrelevant, that history happens to us rather than through us. Progressive historians have spent decades promoting this corrosive falsehood because it justifies their own moral failures while providing intellectual cover for social policies that treat human beings as objects to be managed rather than souls to be elevated. But the evidence of history itself destroys their theories. Every genuine advance in human dignity, every institution that enhances rather than degrades human flourishing, every cultural achievement that still moves us across the centuries, these resulted from individuals whose character enabled them to choose virtue over comfort, principle over profit, eternal significance over temporal advantage. The question facing our generation is whether we'll continue accepting the progressive lie that character doesn't matter, or whether we'll embrace the demanding truth that character is destiny, not just for individuals but for entire civilizations. The choice we make will determine whether America experiences renewal or continues its descent into the kind of moral chaos that has destroyed every great nation that abandoned the character-forming institutions of its ancestors. History is watching. Providence is calling. Character still matters. The time has come to prove it through lives worthy of the civilizational inheritance we've received and the future generations who depend on our choices. This is our moment. This is our test. This is our opportunity to demonstrate that extraordinary individuals can still change the world, that moral courage still trumps material force, that character still determines the course of human affairs. The progressive historians have had their day. Now let character have its due.